Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Rose Writes and I write and narrate Miraculous Ladybug fanfiction. Shout out to Emerin Arts on Instagram for the use of this adorable Tikki fan art. Their Instagram is full of cute things, so go check them out in the link below. This is a story written by Mike Xeno. He is an amazing writer, so make sure to check him out. I've narrated a few of his stories on my channel before, so if you want to check those out, I will link them below as well. Now then, please enjoy the story of the Kwamis. My name is Tikki. I'm a Kwami. What is a Kwami, one might ask? Well, that's not so hard to describe. A bit harder to explain, and perhaps impossible for all but a very few to really understand. To begin with, Kwamis are magical beings, so don't expect this to make a lot of sense. Magic, real magic, doesn't necessarily follow rules. Throw a rock up, it comes down. That's how nature works. Throw the same rock up and it goes sideways or turns green or becomes a hummingbird, or it comes down just like it would have done anyway. That's what magic does, except when it doesn't. Where was I? Ah, yes, Kwamis. One thing to understand about Kwamis is that what you see, if you're ever lucky enough to see us all, is only the smallest part of what we are. We first come into being as, well, that's not quite right, because for most of my existence, I didn't actually exist. We are first conceived as, no, that doesn't work either, because it implies that someone had to think of me before I happened, and that didn't happen. I did say that this wasn't going to make sense, didn't I? Okay, starting over. When someone looks at me, they see a little floating being about 4 inches tall, kind of like a tiny human baby. We have heads that are quite a bit larger than our bodies. I'm also red with black spots, and, if I may be immodest, just awfully cute. I look a bit like a ladybug, and that's not by accident. All of my fellow Kwamis look like animals. That was part of how we first came into physical form. I'll get back to that. Kwamis can fly, pass through solid objects, and we're pretty much immune to any sort of physical harm. We do get hungry, though. We have to eat to maintain our physical presence in the world, and if we go for too long without eating, we can start to fade. We can also become sick, though it doesn't happen often. We experience many of the same feelings that people do. We can be happy or sad, curious or bored, and we feel love. We don't experience being in love, but we see each other as close family, and we can and do form strong bonds with those who are our magical jewels. People who have known us say that we have a childlike innocence, despite the fact that we are all much older than any living thing on Earth. Also, we have powers specific to our nature. I am the Kwami of creation. I can create things. More specifically, I can take matter and energy that exists already and deliberately rearrange it into new forms, or create that which has been destroyed. Of course, pretty much any human being can do this, but I can do it through an effort of will alone. And if there are limits to what I can create, I haven't found them yet. That brings me to, well, I still don't really know how to put it. So let's just say I was born. It's not the right word for it, but there really isn't a word which describes what happened when I happened. Kwamis are born when a specific concept comes into existence. As I said, I am the Kwami of creation. So I was first. Without creation, after all, there is nothing else. People say that it was the Big Bang, which is a completely wrong way to describe it. The universe at the beginning was actually infinitely tiny and absolutely quiet. But I'll call it that because everyone knows what I mean by it. To be clear, I didn't personally create the universe. Even I don't know exactly how that happened, and I was there. Rather, I was born along with everything else. With creation came me, and I was all alone. I don't even know for how long for certain. People who study how the universe was in those early times say that it was about 300,000 years before particles started forming into atoms. I can't confirm or deny that. I had no way to keep track of time, and no concept of what a year was in any event. But this time I'm going to go ahead and take some credit, because it was me who first put together the very first atom. For the first time, something in the universe had been made. Something new was created from existing matter. It was such a small thing, so seemingly insignificant, and yet I was so proud of myself. Well, that feeling lasted about a zillionth of a second. See what happened next? Was plague. Bang and pow! And just like that, my beautiful new atom had become a scattering of subatomic particles and gamma radiation. All hail the dawn of destruction! As he still likes to say. You might think I should have been upset. After all, here I was, born out of the very idea of creation, and as soon as the universe settles down to the point where it's even possible to create something new, it gets almost instantly destroyed. But whatever disappointment or anger or frustration I might have felt was submerged in overwhelming joy. You see, I was no longer alone. Can anyone even begin to imagine what that was like? To be so very, very alone that you don't even know that there's anything else you can be. And then suddenly to realize that you're not alone anymore, that you never have to be alone again? Even if the reason why is plague? Okay, that's not fair. Plague is a Kwami like me. He's the embodiment of destruction though, so in a lot of ways we don't exactly see eye to eye. Even taking into account that at that time eyes didn't exist yet. That having been said, even though I love all my fellow Kwamis, plague is special to me. You can't spend billions of years as the only two beings in the whole universe with anything like consciousness and not form a bond after all. But seriously, don't tell him that or I'll never hear the end of it. And for a Kwami, never is a really long time. In any event, as different as Plague and I might seem, we really are more alike than unalike. One of us can't truly exist without the other. It's why he was born in the same moment that I actually did something for the first time. In order to create something, something else has to be destroyed. When you destroy something, something new is created. We were young then, even as a few billion years passed and we made the entire universe our playground. I would build a star and he would make it go supernova. I would take that matter and energy and create planets and he would rain asteroids down on them. I pulled the stars and planets together into galaxies and he collapsed their cores into black holes. We played together for countless ages, hardly realizing at the time what we left in our wake, as the cycles we started continued of their own accord. Even without our direct intervention, the stars continued to form, shine, and eventually swell and burst. New worlds coalesced from what the stars left behind in their final moments, made from the elements which could only be created by the destruction of the stars that came before. When we didn't feel like playing, we could sit and watch as the universe continued to play without us. And Plague would dance with excitement as he watched a moon become shredded into particles of dust by the gravity of its planet, while I marveled over the beautiful rings which formed as a result. It was wonderful. It was amazing. But what came next was truly miraculous. I honestly don't know if I can take credit for what happened next. I do know that I had no inkling at the time of what it meant and what it would mean someday. I had just watched a new set of worlds come into existence. Their sun igniting for the first time, and the blast of that fire blowing away the free dust and gas which choked the new system, allowing the planets to receive the light and warmth. Plague and I had decided it would be a wonderful new place to play, and so he set about knocking the worlds against each other while I splashed them with water to make oceans, and twirled bands of clouds around the ones which were far enough from their sun to hold onto the atmospheres against the solar wind. Then, on one of those worlds, I saw something new. In a little puddle of goo protecting by chance from the blazing sun by a sheltering stone, the elements had come together in a way that I had never seen before. I might have done it myself while I wasn't paying attention, or maybe it happened just by chance. It might have even happened before that moment and I had just never noticed it before. But whatever it was doing something amazing, something I instantly recognized. It was creating. Somehow this chain of atoms had come together in such a way as to collect other elements from the murky, sludgy water around it, and it had made a crude copy of itself. That copy didn't last long. It was too unstable. But then another chain drifted by and did the same thing, and this time the copy was closer. Close enough that it also made another before collapsing. For the first time since I'd met Plag, I wanted to hide something from him. This, I thought, was too precious. This shouldn't be destroyed. It was elegant. It was beautiful. It was the start of something greater than either of us. It was struck by a comet and obliterated. But now that I knew what to look for, I started seeing these strange new things all over the place. Most of them failed to make more than a few lesser copies of themselves before breaking down. But some were longer and more complex, and their offspring nearly as much so, able to produce dozens of generations until they failed. And then came the one that worked. It made a perfect identical copy. Where there had been one, now there were two. And because they were the same, there soon came another, and then another after that, until they were so numerous that even when many were destroyed, there were always more to replenish their number. Words didn't exist yet. My thoughts were concepts, not sentences. But if I could put what I thought then into words, I know what it would have been. Hello, little creators. Welcome to the universe. Thank you for making it less lonely. Of course, it didn't take long for Plag to make the same discovery, and he was just as overjoyed as I was. Not exactly for the same reasons, of course. He was thrilled because he had found something new to destroy, but it was amazing, because it kept coming right back. And just as it had been in the past, the destruction which Plag wrought actually inspired new creation, as the weaker and less stable strings disintegrated, and then more robust ones which made better copies continued and thrived. The miracle of life had come to stay. Soon I was seeing it everywhere, as if it were such a good idea that every world wanted to try it. Of course, most of the time it didn't get very far. But on some worlds where conditions were just right, and I might have had something to do with that, life really took hold and went wild. Plag and I had a wonderful new game to play, and we loved it. It actually took us a while to realize that someone else had joined our game. We were both taken almost completely by surprise. Again, since it had been just the two of us for so long, we never imagined that there was another way we could be. But along with the advent of life came something else, or rather, someone else. For life does nothing if not grow and multiply, and as these simple chains of atoms became ever greater in number, a new Kwami was born unto us. She was the Kwami of multiplication, and her name was Mulo. And with life also came evolution, as some offspring were changed for the better, more robust and more prone to creating surviving copies. And the Kwami known as Fluff was born. With these changes came new defenses against a harsh environment, bubbles about the delicate strings to keep them safe, and ways the Kwami of protection joined our growing family. I would hope it's clear by now, but these words I've been using weren't really our names at the time. We still didn't have words in such a sense, but when we did eventually acquire the ability to identify ourselves with names, we chose sounds that we liked. And so I'm using the names we would have later. It was because of the new wonder of life that nearly all our fellow Kwamis were born, because life brought us about so many new concepts and ideas. The cells of life became more complex and sophisticated, sending chemical signals to each other to warn of dangers or alert each other to the presence of food, and so we welcomed Nuru, Kwami of transmission. Some forms of life grew larger and stronger, enough to subdue and consume those which were still small, and thus was born the Kwami of subjection named Pollen. The smaller and weaker creatures acquired simple camouflage to hide from their predators, and so Trix, Kwami of illusion, came into being. And so many others followed. Each new concept which came into the universe birthed a new Kwami, and nothing had ever proved so fruitful in the pursuit of the new as this wonderful thing we called life. As life went on and grew and diversified, so did the Kwamis. And before long, there were dozens of us. There were so many wonderful new games to play and so many new Kwamis in our family to play them with. We thought that the universe could never be grander than it had become thus far. Oh, how wrong we were. After a while, the Kwamis, myself included, began to focus on what we found to be the most interesting parts of the universe. We stopped zooming about everywhere and anywhere. We outgrew the old simple games, and instead we concentrated on the miracle of life, all of us curious to see where it would lead. Certain worlds became our favorites, and we spent most of our time on them, watching and playing and mingling with the life we found there. Our favorite world, agreed upon by all, was the one we would come to know as Earth. At this point, the natural thing to wonder is if I and my fellow Kwamis had a hand in bringing the Earth about. Well, it certainly wasn't all my own doing, and in such a vast universe, something like the Earth would surely have been eventually happened anyway. But we were all still young and perhaps a bit impatient. I wanted to see just how far life could go, given every chance to succeed. So if I'm being totally honest, I might have nudged things just a little bit to make the Earth as favorable to life as I could. Plague almost ruined the whole thing, of course. To be fair, he didn't realize what I was up to, so when he chucked a smaller planet at the one I had just finished, he had no idea that he was wrecking something I'd just spent 500 million years getting just right. He knocked one heck of a chunk out of my nice new world, and I don't mind saying I got pretty upset about it. Fortunately, that pile of rock ended up forming a rather splendid moon, much larger than the one I had planned, but that turned out to be a blessing in disguise. The moon was not only very pretty in the sky, it stabilized the periodic motions of the Earth, and therefore the climate, creating the sort of conditions that really allowed life to take off once it had recovered. Before long, the Earth had all of our attention. We tried to let things just proceed naturally, as we had come to understand that life was a lot more fragile than the stuff Plague and I grew up playing with. It didn't take much power to throw life for a serious loop, and we Kwamis didn't exactly have a gentle touch when it came to applying our powers. For instance, when Waze tried thickening up the ozone layer to prevent so much radiation from reaching the ground, he inadvertently caused an ice age which lasted a few million years. Muller's experiment with increasing the number of CO2-breathing bacteria likewise went haywire. As the atmosphere became saturated with oxygen, they exhaled and killed off almost 90% of the life on the planet before new forms were born, which could live and thrive in the changed environment. And don't even get me started on Fluff's little experiments. I think people nowadays call it the Cambrian explosion. It was a nice idea, but it ended up in another mass extinction. What really changed our perspective, however, was Plague's little oops. The Earth was doing really well. We had lots of incredible life forms, bigger than any we had ever had before. Dinosaurs, they would eventually be called. And let me tell you, they came in much greater variety than anyone on Earth now could possibly imagine. People who go around digging up their fossils have barely discovered 1/100th of the number of different kinds of creatures stomping around the Earth in those days. But then for some reason which he's never adequately explained to me, Plague decided to test out a new little trick he'd learned which he called a cataclysm. To be totally fair to Plague, it really was an accident. Sure, he meant to destroy some stuff. That was his raison d'etre after all. He just hadn't realized the extent of the power he'd unleashed. All he'd really wanted to do was blow a crater into a coastline area which he felt needed a bit of shaking up. And so he concentrated his destructive power on that one spot. It was right about when a chunk of the Earth, about the size of modern France, was ejected far enough into space to achieve orbit that Plague realized he might have gone a wee bit too far. The blast wave circled the globe in less than an hour, followed by a wave of searing heat which, well, I'll spare the gory details. Suffice to say that when the dust settled, the dinosaurs had been all but wiped out. Most of everything else was gone as well, and Plague had a lot of explaining to do. I'll say this much for him, he did feel pretty bad about the whole thing. This was really the first time that we Kwamis realized the true extent of the power we held, and the potential consequences if we used that power without extreme caution. Certainly we had caused some fairly major disruption before, but Plague had been actively trying to keep the impact small. We had to be very, very careful going forward, and hopefully find some way to place limits on our own power so that such accidents would not happen again. But life recovered, even from such a severe blow. Life in the deep oceans largely survived, protected from the worst of Plague's cataclysm. On land, the burrowing insects managed to pull through the worst of the aftermath. Even some of the smaller dinosaurs, The ones who didn't need as much to eat and had feathers to keep them warm throughout the subsequent freezing winters continued on. The real survivors were the mammals, though. Tiny little furry creatures who up until that time had been mere snacks for the dinosaurs had been given the chance to come into their own. They could hibernate through the worst of the winters, emerging only when the weather mellowed to find the food which would last them through the next freeze. And with their predators gone, they grew and changed, and filled the niches which had been left open. They became mighty predators themselves, larger, stronger, and smarter than before. In the aftermath, even I had to admit that these new creatures were more fascinating than the dinosaurs had been. We left them strictly alone, of course. We didn't play any games with them this time. We let them grow and live and change on their own, watching but not interfering. There were plenty of other worlds where we could play our games without disturbing the precious earth. Some of us, myself included, wondered if life would really progress all that far without us to push it along. It turned out that even the most optimistic among us had severely underestimated what the earth would come up with next. Because we were just watching now and not doing, we found less impactful ways to entertain ourselves. One new game, and we had no way of realizing how much it would end up affecting us personally, was to choose our favorite creatures on the earth, learning all we could about them, and even changing our own appearance so that our fellow Kwamis perceived us in similar forms. Mulo, for example, loved the scampering little mice who bred into such multitudes and spread all over the planet, and so she took that form. Waze appreciated the turtles secure within their tough shells, carrying their own shelters upon their backs. Shupu liked the primates, the way they swung through the trees and taunted the creatures who could not reach them, flinging their... well, let's just say the monkey suited him. For myself, I found I couldn't really identify with any of the new creatures on Earth. I was a creator, and although there were animals who could build new things from the existing sources, none of them really resonated with me. In a way, I was still partial to the simpler creatures of the world. The insects and the microbes, as they reminded me of the very first forms of life which I had discovered so long ago. But none of them were my favorites, at least at the time. All that aside, something major was about to happen, and none of us saw it coming. Up until now, we had seen another Kwami born of the universe maybe once every few million years at most, and there had not been anyone new since the cataclysm. So when Sass, the Kwami of intuition, emerged from the earth to join us, we all sat up and took notice. We found the source within a small, otherwise insignificant valley in a land which would later be called Africa. There, in that isolated place, we found new creatures similar to the monkeys which Shupu liked so much, but they were different in important ways. They walked upright upon just 2 legs, not like the birds or some of their long-lost dinosaur ancestors who crouched low, but standing up straight and tall. With their 4 legs that had evolved to hang from tree branches and grasp onto their prey, they picked up rocks and sticks, and then they used them. A stick or a long bone could keep a dangerous predator at bay. A rock could crack a nut or the skull of one of their own prey. But most of all, these creatures had minds that could teach and learn these things. They looked at the world and wondered at it just like we Kwamis did. They uttered sounds to each other which meant things and conveyed complex thoughts. They felt wide ranges of emotion, they had imagination, and they even questioned the wonder of their own existence. And more than any other creature ever had before them, they created. They created not just simple tools, but concepts and ideas. And though they didn't mean to and didn't know it, they also created new Kwamis. We all saw the potential in them, and we were tremendously excited. These creatures, these people, could be what we had been waiting for all our existence without even knowing it. See, we had spent eons playing our games and watching the universe grow and change and come alive. But through these creatures, we could potentially have something more, something greater. We could have purpose. By the time the ancestors of people had really worked out how useful opposable thumbs could be, the Kwamis who had been born as a direct result of them numbered close to 1,000. This explosion of new ideas told me that I had been right about them. This wasn't just a new life form we could watch or play with. These were creatures who we might actually communicate with, share our experiences and our lives, and come to a common understanding. Even more, Perhaps we could even help them achieve more in their own lives. But we were fundamentally different from them. They were real and were ethereal. We had no substance. We couldn't interact with people unless we used our powers, which were so strong as to potentially obliterate them. They couldn't see us, hear us, or touch us in any way. But they had already changed us by expanding our family so greatly. And if nothing else, I wanted to thank them because every new Kwami was another way in which I didn't have to be alone. We all wanted to be able to talk to these new creatures, who had more and greater understanding than any other life which had come before them. But I believe I wanted it most of all. Only I knew what it was like to be truly alone. And even with all the new Kwamis, I still recalled the weight and despair of that loneliness. I loved my Kwami family, but I wanted to know someone else in a way. I wanted these people to be our friends. To this day, I don't know if what I did next was ultimately a wonderful thing or a terrible thing. I knew even then that it was dangerous, but how much so, I had no idea. Still, I think that even knowing what would result, I would do it again, because the alternative would have been to watch these people join the many millions of creatures who came and went before them, lost to the universe in extinction. You see, although the people were intelligent and intuitive beyond any other creatures on Earth, they lacked the strength of the fierce beasts who would prey upon them. Their young were helpless and required so much care. They would die more often than they would grow and mature. And it was all the more tragic because more than any of the creatures who came before them, these people loved their children and grieved terribly for their loss. Furthermore, as the cycles of climate went on, the earth itself began to cool, and the people lacked the warm pelts and the ability to hibernate which would allow them to survive. Their numbers dropped each year until only a few thousand remained, and they were cold and frightened and starving. I didn't want to lose them. But did I dare to use my power directly? Anything I created might lead to their downfall, just as plague had done to the dinosaurs who once ruled the earth. The best of my intentions might result in the worst of calamities. But as I watched their infants perish one by one, succumbing to hunger or to stalking predators, I could stand it no longer. I approached Plague and told him of my plan. I thought by working together we could achieve something that neither of us could do alone. His was the power of destruction, and mine was creation. We balanced each other, and by channeling our power together, we might be able to temper it, control it, with a small and localized effect. I have to say, he jumped at the chance, and I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea about Plague, even though he's the embodiment of destruction. It's not like Plague revels in causing death and turmoil. He had simply grown bored with tossing asteroids at each other and busting up moons into rings. He wanted to do something that someone would notice. We didn't tell the others. Perhaps we should have, but I didn't want to be talked out of it. We descended upon the earth, found where the people lay huddled and afraid. And then we did something that no Kwamis had ever done before. We unified our power into one, and with the utmost caution, we struck with both creation and destruction at the same time. The result was a bolt of lightning from a clear sky. It arced down from the heavens and into the heart of a great tree about which the people had gathered, blasting it into 1,000 burning pieces. The people screamed and ran for their lives, terrified of what they had seen. But when they stopped running, they turned and looked back. Shattered branches and shards ripped from the tree trunk lay all about, and while some burned from end to end, a few sprouted flames only from the tip. And the people could feel that it was warm and bright, and they saw that the dirt and stones which the flaming bits lay upon did not burn them. After what seemed like millennia, and I know what it really means to literally wait for that long, one of them who was braver than the rest stepped forward. Or perhaps she was simply young and did not understand the danger which lay before her. She reached down and took a burning branch from its unburnt end. She lifted it from the ground, and the fire burned at its tip but did not harm her. She walked back to her camp and offered it to a young man who, like her, was less afraid than the others. He then took the burning branch and laid it upon the pile of splinters which had landed in a heap, and the flame spread into the pile, but no further. Her companions, their curiosity overcoming their fear, dared to approach closer. They also felt the warmth, but they were not burned by it so long as they did not come too close. The fire could be contained, controlled, kept within a small space and fed to keep it alive. They looked back and saw the reflections in the eyes of the animals who stayed back out of fear. And slowly some of them began to understand. They had longed for warmth and security and hope. Though they did not know it, Plague and I had granted their wish. We rejoiced even as the people themselves did, knowing we had saved them. We didn't know then what we came to understand over time. The universe demands balance, and for every wish granted there is a price to pay. The price for the gift of fire would be high indeed, one which would be paid over the next 1,000,000 years. Humanity was saved by the taming of fire, and they well understood how precious this power was. Almost 1,000,000 years later, there would still be myths and legends told about how fire had been given to people by powerful beings who lived in the heavens. They didn't know how it had happened at the time, of course, so they invented stories about gods named Prometheus, Azazel, Maui, and dozens of other names. Even the people who would live in a time where such stories were accepted as myths still understood the importance of the gift of fire and how it made everything possible that humans would ever do. And that, perhaps, was the price ultimately to be paid. Because the people didn't use the fire only to protect themselves from the cold, cook their food, or aid in the making of their tools. They used it also against each other and to do great harm, sometimes directly, sometimes to help them make other weapons. As time would go on, they would refine their technology into ever more deadly forms, and we Kwamis would live to see the day when the people would use the fire to ignite explosives and propel bits of metal to kill each other by the millions. With fire came the salvation of humanity, and even now it could be the means of their demise. I've never told any of them, until now, that I was the one ultimately responsible. But that was all still in the future. For the moment, the people survived, and slowly they began to thrive. We did not dare to interfere with them directly again, as Plague and I had inadvertently shown that doing so, even with the best of intentions, could have unforeseen consequences. We patiently watched as they learned new skills, devised more detailed language, and formed symbiotic relationship with some of the animals around them. They invented agriculture and began to live in towns or even cities, and they could take the time to learn about more than just the basics of survival. We waited in great anticipation as we knew that the people were on the verge of something great. We just didn't know what. Then something else happened which none of us had ever imagined could happen. Some of the people, a very select few, started to become aware of us in their midst. It started with isolated incidents which could be written off as coincidence, with some people seeming startled as we drifted by, looking at the place where we had just been. Or perhaps they would seem to hear us as we spoke to each other, looking about us to see where the voices came from or even responding to what we said. They called us spirits or fairies, and made up more stories about us. People are great storytellers. But these interactions were fleeting and so tenuous that they could easily be dismissed as imagination. Nothing makes someone long for a goal more than to have it almost within reach. And Kwamis are the same as people in this way. Ever since they had first appeared, we all wished to be able to join these beings in their reality, to know them as friends, to live among them. None of us knew that we were about to get our wish, and none of us considered that once again, that wish would demand a price. Ever since the beginning, we Kwamis had understood that there was something different about us that set us apart from the rest of the universe. Matter and energy, space and time, it had to follow rules. There were constants of nature, ultimate limits, predictable results from similar actions. We were apart from that. We could affect the universe with our powers, but the reverse was not true. We could fly through the heart of exploding stars, outrace a beam of light, exist for countless eons without the concern of decay or death. We were different. The universe was real. The Kwamis were ethereal. The people seemed to understand this as well. The world that they could see and hear and touch they called reality or nature. But the part which they could not see except the bare glimpses, the forces which made impossible things happen, the part that didn't follow rules, that was what they called magic. And some of them were learning to tap into the magic. Some of them knew we were there, and they were trying to reach out to us. We should have seen it coming. We knew how ingenious people could be. And we ought to have known that one day they would find a way to cross the chasm between our two worlds. It started with just one person. I can't tell you very much about her, not even a name which few of you now could pronounce anyway. She lived in a time not long after people had learned to record their words in writing, in a place not so far from where the Guardian Temple stands today. I don't know how she did what she did. It shouldn't have been possible. But that is, after all, the nature of magic. Whatever she did called me to her. And when I came into her presence, I saw that she had created a jewel. Not an ordinary crystal such as one could find in the depths of the earth where minerals might form beautiful and cold gemstones. No, this was a stone which had been truly formed through magic. It was simple, even crude, but it was essentially the same magic of creation within me. I remember it was red. I had been there when the entire universe glowed red, when every bit of matter was fiery hot and redness was everything and everywhere. And so believe me when I say this jewel was red in the same way. Like everything that ever was or will be had been crushed down into this stone which burned red. It felt like a part of me, and without even thinking of what might happen, I instinctively summoned my own power and let it flow into the jewel. The imperfections within the crystal were realigned and set into harmony. Its very matter reformed into a perfect sphere glowing brighter as the magic within was purified and concentrated. It was so inviting. It called me to it, drew me toward it. It never occurred to me to resist the pull. I flew to the stone and all of my being went inside that place that sparkled with living magic. And in that moment, I felt myself become real. And well, I guess I went a little too far with what happened next. I could tell on some level what was taking place. I was about to emerge into the real world, a truly physical being, and I wanted to make an entrance. So I cracked through the jewel like it was an egg. It split into two halves, and with a flash of light, there I was. I looked the same in that first moment of true reality as I do now. And just as I would the day I greeted the first person I saw in front of me, speaking for the first time with words just as people do. "Hello, it's so nice to meet you." It took a little while for my maker to wake up again after that. But once we had the chance for a proper introduction, that's when things really started to get interesting. My maker called herself a guardian. She's one of an already ancient order who protected what little was known of the magic in the world. They had been the first of the people to invent the concept of writing. Of course, it being such a useful idea, other people discovered it on their own eventually. The other guardians had been content to record their knowledge and keep it hidden, but she wanted to use the magic, and the result was me. I was ecstatic at this turn of events. Finally, to be able to speak and be seen and understood by one of the people who we had only been able to watch for so long. I told her all about myself and my fellow Kwamis. And if my story has been confusing to you so far, just imagine what it was like the first time I had to explain it all to someone who didn't even know what atoms are or how the universe became what it is today. Furthermore, that came after hours of assuring her that she hadn't accidentally conquered a demon or some other evil creature which would annihilate the world. I'm so glad it was me and not Plague who came first, because I'm sure he would have gone along with the whole malevolent demon thing just to have a laugh. We had to discover a few things together, because this was just as new to me as it was to the Guardian. We found that my physical being was in some way tied to the jewel, even though it was broken in two. I couldn't move too far away from it without becoming weak, so she took the two pieces and hid them inside a pair of earrings, in order to keep them always with her. Over time, I became stronger and able to venture further from the jewel, but eventually I would always need to return. Oh, and remember that I mentioned how my physical form looks like a ladybug? That was because of the Guardian as well. See, she wasn't just fooling around with forces she didn't understand at all. She was a very wise woman, and she knew that if she went about it the wrong way, that the result could be disastrous. She fully intended to conjure a being who represented some fundamental concept of creation, and she deliberately chose the form of a ladybug. To her people, ladybugs represented good fortune. They are benign creatures who do no harm to people, and she wanted the being she conjured to have those qualities. Later guardians would find that the choice of creature upon which a Kwami is based means little insofar as how they relate to humanity. One of the wisest and most beloved among the number is Sass, who has the form of a snake, and snakes and people don't exactly get along. But for myself, I am the Ladybug Kwami, and that suits me beautifully. I still had much of my power, though it had been diminished now that I was real. I could still fly about without regard to gravity or air pressure. I could zip through solid objects, and I could still wield my power of creation, though it remained dangerously strong and difficult to control as I came to learn. For example, the Guardian asked if I could raise a new island up out of the sea, and while I was happy with the result, I still haven't figured out how to make it stop. Nowadays, people call it Hawaii. We discovered other things as well, so many things in those first few exciting days together. I could reunite with the jewels and the earrings, which were magically as one, even though physically divided. And in so doing, I could give a measure of my power as a Kwami to my Guardian. She would become a woman of tremendous strength and agility, clothed in my colors and donning a mask which hid her true identity from even her closest family. Upon her command, I would transform her thus, and she would become what she had always wanted to be, a force for good in the world, using magic to help others and to defeat those with evil intentions. As I said, I can't reveal her name, even after all this time. But when she transformed, she was Mahila. I loved her. I loved what I could do when we joined, as I quickly learned that when I tried to use my powers without her to help me control them, the result was uncontrolled mayhem. Most of all, I loved the sense of being with someone like her. Once again, I had been alone in a way that I didn't even know was loneliness, and when we became one together was when I was happiest. It was true that Mahila wielded the power in our relationship. I was, and I still am, bound to the jewel. I had to follow her commands, transform her when she wished, submit my will to her own. For people, I know that this is something intolerable. People valued their freedom sometimes even over their very lives. And don't get me wrong, I can understand why. But my perspective as a Kwami is a different one. For time without measure, I had all the freedom I could ever want, the entire universe to roam about in and create as I saw fit. I really don't mind letting someone else take over the lead for a little while. It's just a blip in my lifetime anyway. Besides, there's still a part of me out there among the stars, as free as I've ever been. Only the me that's here on Earth is tied to the earrings of the Ladybug, and to the one who wears them. And that part of me is still a child even after all the years since I first appeared. It won't make sense to people. I know it doesn't. It's just something fundamentally different between Kwamis and humans. We are as we are, and so are you. Oh, and she introduced me to honey-sweetened bread. Love it! Of course, it didn't take long for the other Guardians to take notice. Mahila had shown them what was possible. They asked me about others of my kind, and I told them how there were a great many of us, one for every concept they could name. Naturally, as I was the Kwami of creation, they inquired as to whether one existed who represented destruction, so I had to tell them about Plague. Oddly, it was a young boy who next discovered the secret to making a jewel which could summon a Kwami into being. He chose his pet kitten as Plague's form, as the little creature certainly could be destructive, but never out of malicious intent. And so it was that Plague came into the real world, bound to a jewel that was sealed into a silver ring. Once again, I'm afraid I'm unable to reveal his true name, but when he wore the ring and became one with Plague, he called himself Kalo Baralo. Not all the Guardians were pleased at this, I have to say. Some said it was dangerous to introduce the very embodiment of destruction into the world. But others, including Mahila, pointed out that destruction itself was not inherently evil. That fire brings warmth and light even as it destroys the wood, that the ground must be broken by the plow before seeds can be planted, and that the rains which flooded the land leave the soil more fertile than it was before. There must be a balance, they said. And as the Ladybug wielded the powers of creation, so the Black Cat should wield the powers of destruction. But even the wisest of the Guardians failed to realize at first the enormity of the power that they had unleashed, balanced or otherwise. I need to make it clear that both Mahila and Kalo Baralo had the best of intentions. They were trying to help people, and in the end I feel they did more good than harm. But there is no denying that harm was done. It began with a drought. It wasn't caused due to the actions of any Kwami. It was simply one of those things that happened sometime in the ebb and flow of the climate. The Guardian Temple, which at the time was still just a small collection of rough statues made of carefully stacked rocks and mortar, which was a little more than dried mud, existed then as it is today, in what would become known as Tibet. Around us lay the lands of Mongolia and China, and it was there that the drought struck. It just wouldn't rain. At least not more than the barest trickle. Crops could only be grown near the rivers, and that wasn't nearly enough to feed so many. People were starving, and Mahila felt he had to do something. So together he and Kalambaralo ascended to the highest of the mountain peaks, the one called Shalamalongma. People today assume that it was climbed for the first time in 1953, but that was just the first time it was done by people without superpowers. Then they drew upon their magic together. As Kalabaralo used the power of destruction to melt the snow and ice all around, Mahila formed it into the clouds and sent them across the mountains to rain upon the lowlands. It took all of their energy to accomplish this mighty task, and it drained Plague and I to the point of exhaustion. But when they descended, they saw to their horror that they had gone too far. The power they had unleashed reached not only into the drought-stricken lands, but around the world. Swollen by the torrential rains, rivers flooded across the globe and inundated the settlements on their banks, not just once, but over and over again. All of humanity was threatened, and though they tried to mitigate the damage done, the power of the Miraculous seemed inadequate to reverse what the same power had already done. Mahila refused to give up, however. She returned to the temple, intent upon finding a way to put a stop to the havoc wreaked upon the world. For almost 2 months she meditated, while young Kalabaralo did what he could with his own power to hold back the floodwaters and save as many lives as possible. Eventually, and perhaps out of sheer desperation, Mahila simply asked me what I would do. I was younger then. Well, not really much younger in terms of time, but I was naive about the world because I had only existed in my real form for a few years. All I could tell her was that in the time before she had called me into true existence, I and the other Kwamis often found that the best we could do was trust to fate. And so that's what she did. Mahila called me to her and upon transforming beseeched the universe itself for luck. The matter and energy around her coalesced into something which took shape in her hand. A pair of flat and smooth stones joined together at the center with a string tied about the axle. In its shape and color it resembled the shell of a ladybug, the form she had chosen for me. It was a simple child's toy, one she had often played with in her youth. In the future it would eventually be called a yo-yo. Who can say why this object appeared, why it took that form? Perhaps there is something in the universe which brings luck to those who need it most. Those who want to do what is right and preserve life. Whatever it was that made this thing, Mahila somehow knew exactly what to do with it. She spun it high into the air and with a cry summoned the very essence of her power, the miraculous ladybugs. A cloud of tiny glowing beetles burst from this lucky charm, flowing out from the temple and all around the world, and what they touched became healed. The rivers were returned to their banks, the clouds receded, and even the collateral destruction done by Kalabaralo as he tried to fight back the floodwaters was reversed, restoring everything to how it had been. Of course, the people of the world had no idea what they saw, but they knew that it was good and that their lives had been saved. For centuries afterward, and even to this very day, stories would be told of the great floods which lasted for weeks, and then the rainbows which appeared in the sky and made the waters recede. Only very few know the truth of what happened back then, how the power of the Miraculous came so close to destroying the world, and then saved it once again. That was the last time that Mahila ever wore the Miraculous of the Ladybug. She said that no one person should ever wield such power unchecked. It was too late to pretend that the power of the Miraculous didn't exist. Even if the jewels were destroyed and Plague and I were returned to our ethereal states, the fact that such jewels could be made meant that someday they could be remade, and the next person to do so could easily have wrongful intentions. And so Mahila established the Order of the Guardians anew with a new purpose. Along with the others, they laid down the laws which would govern them all the way to the present day. They would exist to understand and keep watch over the power of the miraculous jewels, ensuring that this power would be used wisely. The guardians would not wear the jewels themselves, but instead they would grant them to those who would be worthy of their power. People who were inherently strong of mind and soul, but also selfless and willing to make personal sacrifice for the greater good. The guardians knew that inevitably mistakes would be made, and there would be times when Miraculous fell into evil hands. And so they made more of them, bringing other Kwamis into reality and tying their power to the jewels. And so that if one were compromised, the others could be used to subdue a malevolent Miraculous holder. They placed limitations upon the jewels themselves, so that young bearers could not access their full power until they had reached adulthood and were ready for such responsibility. They learned ways in which the powers could be enhanced further, keeping these secrets closely guarded so that only the highest guardians would know how it was done. And then they set out in search of heroes. The guardians traveled across the entirety of the world, knowing that they must accept only the very best that humanity had to offer, no matter how far they must go to find them. The next holder of the earrings of the Ladybug was found in Polynesia, and she called herself Wahine Aloha. She also asked me my name, something that even Mahila had never thought to do. I decided to name myself Tikki, the word for happiness among her people. And even after thousands of years, I have never thought of a name I would have wanted more. The ring of the black cat went to a young man from northeastern Africa, and he called himself Bakar. Plag's master likewise allowed his Kwami to choose his own name, perhaps a bit foolishly in this case. And as something of a joke, he chose to name himself after a virulent disease. I sometimes wonder if Plag might have chosen differently had he known the name would stick with him for the next 5,000 years. Probably not. Bakar and Wahine Aloha were both brought to the temple for training, and by this time it had become a temple in truth. With the magic of the Miraculous, the guardians had constructed a veritable fortress, one which would stand for centuries to come. There, the two of them began what would turn out to be something of a tradition when it came to the holders of these particular miraculous jewels. They fell in love. But that's a tale for another time. So now you know how the Kwamis came to be, how we helped to make the world you know, and how in turn you humans help us to become real, so that we could live among you as friends and companions. There is so much more to be told about the guardians and the miraculous holders, and the ways in which we Kwamis have contributed to the story of humanity. It is a story in which we are pleased to take part. We are so happy to know you. Thank you for making the universe less lonely. Thank you so much for listening. I really, really hope you enjoyed this. Don't forget to check out Mike Xeno down below, and please leave a like and a comment below telling me what you thought. Stay miraculous!